Tonight we have a very interesting shir. It's the climax of everything we've been speaking to up to now. It's a very unusual shir. I very rarely give this one. It, in actuality, follows everything I've said till now, and it's the summation. What do I mean? Up to now we've been speaking about justice, the concept of din or mishpat, and the way God exercises His attribute of justice in the world. We've been speaking about basically the answer to the question, why do things happen to people? Whether it's good things or whether it's bad things, why do these things befall people? And we've given quite a lengthy explanation, and very simply we've said that there are several different reasons, 3 different reasons that explain basically all the different occurrences or events which happen to a person. And we went into these different types of causes in somewhat an exhaustive fashion. What we have to discuss tonight is something which transcends the causes themselves. And what we want to understand tonight is, how does God operate in the world? The operative mode. We are not so much concerned now with the specifics of what the Baruch Hashem does, in terms of the way He exercises judgment or why He does things. That we discussed in the last month and a half. What I'd like to discuss tonight is the mechanism itself, the essential mechanism of providence. And what I will discuss tonight, unfortunately, is sensed by, I would say, by quite a number of people, but it's very vaguely understood. And what I want to do tonight is to go into the mechanism of providence itself, the hashgacha, in terms of the essential, the system, or the operative mode. So we're going to be discussing very new ideas, the concept of internal versus external causal necessary systems. So if this shir sounds like a shir on physics, you'll have to pardon me. There are certain similarities that it will have. And we will begin to see some of the inner fabric of a ruchnistic system, of what the world of spirituality is, what the ruchnistic world is. And remarkably, we'll begin to see that it is not that much different than the physical world itself, although it appears to be vastly different. There are certain very basic structural parallelisms, and that's what we're going to bring out. Now, what am I talking about when I say causal necessary systems, internal versus external necessity, and so on? What am I talking about? Let's investigate some very critical concepts. When a person jumps off a building, what happens? Well, essentially the person knows what's going to be. He knows that as soon as he jumps off that building and he loses equilibrium, what's going to happen is certain forces will begin to impinge on him, mainly the force of gravity, and begin to draw him down. And what is going to happen is that he'll be killed by the time he reaches the ground. Now he knows that. How does he know that? Because he knows that there are certain forces in the world, there are certain essential mechanisms which run the world, and he can predict in advance what will happen. When a person puts the key into the engine and starts his car, he knows essentially that there are certain basic connections to the key in the wheel, in the ignition, and the entire system of the car itself. He knows that because the car is designed according to specific laws of automotive engineering, which utilize the laws of physics. So he will know in advance, basically, what kind of path, the specific acts that he will do, where will end up, the ultimate consequences. When we do things in our daily life, we are aware in advance of the physical laws, essentially, which govern a great deal of our behavior. We know things, we know that if we move in certain ways, if we walk in certain ways, we know that certain things will happen. We are familiar with the laws of motion on an experiential level, and the laws of many of aspects of the physical world as we live in our daily lives. The question is, are these the only set of laws which govern our lives, the physical laws? And the answer is not. There are another set of laws that govern our lives. In our case, it's the code of laws which is enacted by Congress or by the state legislatures that basically control the way we live as well. There are laws of taxation, there are laws of criminal laws, there are civil laws, and so on and so forth that we adhere to as we just go through the daily events of life. The question that I want to ask is, what is the difference between, for example, the criminal code or the penal code of the United States, let's say of New York State, and the physical laws of the world? What essentially is the difference between these two law systems? What's the difference in these sets of laws? What is the difference between the laws of physics, the laws of biology and chemistry, and the laws, the legislative laws that we follow on a day-to-day basis in order to conform with what we see is promulgated by the different legislative bodies? What is the difference? So we see to ourselves that there's a very vast difference. How? For example, you cannot controvert a law of physics or a law of reality unless in some way you introduce a mechanism which will allow you to manipulate it. You cannot get away from the law of gravity. It is impossible to defy it. Gravity exists whenever there are two masses, and it upholds its essential force in those two cases. There's no way around it. When we send men to the moon, when we send up satellites, we are constantly taking into account the laws of gravity and the laws of motion. And everything we do, the employment of rockets, the employment of all forms of chemical energy and nuclear energy, are constantly dealing with the reality of the physical forces of gravity. But what about the laws of mankind? What about the laws of men that men make? For example, there's a law in the book that says about larceny. You're not supposed to steal. You're not supposed to steal a car. If you steal a car, you're liable, you can be convicted, indicted, and convicted for something called grand larceny. Okay, that's the law that's on the books. It is. What's the important feature about that law? The important feature about that law is that if I do steal a car and nobody sees me, I can get away with it. It's a law that can be what? It's a law that can be transgressed without consequence. That's the nature. That's the essential nature of all the laws of men. Laws of mankind, laws of men are made. Why? Because of conventional reasons, in order to control basic behavior patterns so that the societies can live. It's designed to create patterns of civilization so that men can get along with each other. But what is the efficacy of the law itself? How strong is that law? What is the power of the law itself? Well, the power of the law is no greater than the people themselves. If people choose to break those laws, then what happens, those people can actually break them without any consequences. If a person steals a car and gets away with it, nobody knows the difference. However, if there's a cop on the corner and he sees it, and he grabs the guy, then the law suddenly takes effect, and the law can be upheld. It's like they say, it's not illegal to break the law, it's illegal to get caught. That's an old saying of the system, well, that's applied in many different ways. But there's a certain logic in what it says, even though ethically it may not be true. The illegality of the laws, the convention laws, or of men, are essentially laws that can be broken without consequence. So we see there are two kinds of legal systems. There are two kinds of systems which attempt to control behavior or the way we deal with reality. There's the laws of physical reality, and there's the law of what? Of mankind. There's the laws of civilization. And we see that there's a very big difference between the two. That the laws of physical reality cannot be broken, they must be dealt with, they must be taken into account, and the laws of humankind, of mankind, must be dealt with. I mean, do not have to be dealt with, they can be broken without any kinds of negative results. What about the halachas of the Torah? That's the question. The laws of the Torah. The laws of the Torah itself. Now, what exactly is the Torah? The 5 books. Can we give some kind of a definition? Well, there are a number of different definitions. But probably the simplest definition would be, it's a manual of behavioral prescriptions. Means it's a manual consisting of do's and don'ts, which essentially was revealed to us by the Rebbeinu Shalom at a certain point in time. That's a very simple definition of what it is. It is a code of do's and don'ts. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. What we call loisesei, thou shalt not, and essay, positive commandments to do. Positive and negative commandments. There are 365 negative commandments, 248 positive commandments. The sum total is taryag, or 613 mitzvahs. And the entire Torah essentially is a narrative description and a legislative code telling us what those halachas are, what those laws are. Those laws, of course, are called mitzvahs, which means commandments, or halachas, which means ways of conduct. But that's what the Torah is. Now, the interesting question is, therefore, that the system, or the legal system of the Torah, what kind of system is that? Is that similar to the laws of physical reality? Or is it similar to the criminal code of the New York State legislature? Interesting question, isn't it? It's a strange way to look at it. But it's a very valid way. I'm not concerned, and this is important, I'm not concerned at this point with the fact that it's divinely revealed. That's not my concern. That is critical for another reason. But at this point, I'm not interested in that. I want to understand what is the mechanism of consequence in these laws, you see. How do these laws run? Can I break them without consequence? You see? Or is there automatic consequence? What's the power of a mitzvah or the power of a halacha? You see? And let's leave God out of the picture for a minute. What is it? Well, there's only one answer you can give, which I'm sure all of you will give the same answer, although many of you will not be clear as to why that is. But it's quite obvious that the laws of the Torah are very similar to the laws of physical reality. But there's something wrong, because it's not precise. What do we mean by that? What does that mean? New York State criminal law says you're not supposed to steal. If you steal and you get away with it, you've gotten away with it. But the Torah says, lo yisignoy, also thou shalt not steal, it says. And let's look at it in a place where you're not supposed to deal with, let's say, monetary. You're not supposed to steal someone else's possessions. What happens if you steal someone else's possessions? So the Torah says, certain laws, the Torah says that you have to return it. You have to return it, and so on and so forth. But let's say a person says, I don't want to do this. I got away with this. I just stole this person's car, and I want to use it. It's mine. It's mine. You see, what consequence will entail? What do you see? I don't see anything. I don't see any cop around, or at all. For example, a person doesn't want to put on tefillin. He doesn't want to put on tefillin in the morning. He doesn't put on tefillin in the morning. So what? So there's a halacha, there's a law in the Torah that says you're supposed to put on tefillin. It says that. And the person doesn't put on tefillin. So therefore what? What's going to happen to this person? Really? What, is God going to suddenly come down and strike him dead? You can see a bolt of lightning come out of the heaven that's going to punish him? That's absurd. There are many people that don't want to put on tefillin, and we don't see an increase in thunderstorms at all. So therefore the question here is, what exactly does it mean when the Torah says a certain halacha? What is the existential validity of a halacha in the Torah? You see, we obviously know from everything that I said that you're not going to get away with a thing. You're not. What does that mean? It means that if you don't put on tefillin in the morning, you will be punished. It means that if you steal something which doesn't belong to you, somewhere down the line, some type of retribution will occur. We know that. But the fascinating question is, how? Who's going to do it? Who's going to do this kind of retribution? You see, some malach? Where is it going to come from? And many times the retribution that does finally happen is so subtle that nobody even knows that that was the retribution for something you did wrong. But how does that system work? You see, that's what we're going to discuss tonight. How that system works. What is the nature of retribution? And I mean either positive or negative, either to be punished or to be rewarded at the same time, which is seen in the laws of the Torah. Because it is obviously that the laws of the Torah are like the laws of physics, the laws of reality. You cannot controvert them without some form of consequence. Why? Because this is the fundamental premise, and this is what it is. The laws of Torah are behavioral prescriptions, aren't they? Do, don't do. So therefore we think, since they're behavioral prescriptions, that they're very similar to the laws of what? Of the government, the laws of the courts, of the American judicial system, or whatever have you. If those are do's and don'ts. It may not be said do's and don'ts, but essentially that's what the whole system is about. This is what you can do, and this is what you cannot do. So we look at this literary format of the Torah, and we look at the literary format of the codes, the penal codes, or whatever have you, and they look very the same. They're very similar. They may not be exactly the same in terms of halakha, in terms of legal content, but essentially they're both behavioral prescriptions telling us what to do and what not to do. So the immediate inclination is to say they must internally be a similar type of legal system. But we know from Hashkafa that this can't be true. You see, it cannot be true. That somehow the laws of Torah have a much greater power than the laws of society. But the question is why? Why does it have a greater power? You see, because of one basic idea. Why is it that the laws of physics have so much power over us? Because the laws of physics are the laws of reality. The physical world means that the reality components of the physical world behave according to certain types of rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations are called physical laws, you see. It happens to be that two objects, two masses, will attract each other with a certain type of force which is directly proportional to the amount of mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance. I'll tell you this. This is the halakha which is in the two masses itself, you see. This piece of chalk, if I drop it, right, will fall at a certain rate. Nobody tells this chalk how fast to fall. Nobody. How does this chalk know what to do? How? Nobody tells it how fast to fall at all. So how does it know? If you take a bullet, if you shoot a gun through a piece of glass, and suddenly, have you ever seen the slow motion of it, and suddenly you see like the thing spreads out? Every shot of glass, every piece of glass goes in a specific direction with a specific speed. How does each piece know where to go? How? Do you see someone there telling it, well, you have to go here and you have to go here and so on? How do the hundreds of thousands of pieces that suddenly fracture and fragment know exactly where to go? And they go in such a way it is so predictable that it is uncanny. And they will go the same way every time, assuming that the bullet hits the glass in exactly the same point, for example, with the same velocity and the momentum and so on. If you take in all physical parameters in equal systems, the consequences will always be equal. Always. But why? And who tells these things where to go? The answer is, they know it that way by virtue of their internal being. They know that through their own existence. It is written or engraved in their very substance what the regulations of their existence are. So they simply do what they know they have become. They act. Their actions, the actions of neutral objects or impersonal objects, are nothing more than the expressions of their being as they're shifted around by constant changing forces and realities. Physical laws are the laws of reality. They are the descriptions of the way reality will behave. Except that no one says to a bullet or to a piece of glass, do and don't. That's ridiculous. Nobody says to this chalk, I say to you and I command you that when I drop you, you shall fall. There is no such thing as a behavioral prescription to a physical event. Because the behavioral prescription is written into the reality of the event itself. If that's the basic premise, that's why the laws of Torah are essentially existential in nature. Meaning, the following. If I steal something from someone else, a consequence must ensue. Why? Because I will have in some way intervened in some reality and what? And affected a level of some reality. And what happens is that reality will then turn around and affect my reality. That's why it happens. Because the laws of the Torah, even though they're written as do's and don'ts, are really not a book of behavioral prescriptions. It has nothing to do with the criminal code. The laws of the Torah is nothing more than the physics of a different reality. And that reality is what? Is the reality of Ruchnius, or spiritual reality, or supernatural reality. What is the nature of that reality? We're not going to go into that. That's not relevant. What is critical is that there exists another mode of reality beyond the physical, called Ruchnius, called spiritual, which obey as precise laws of their existence as the physical reality does here. That's why I can go into that reality. That's why I can force a consequence. These are not arbitrary aspects. The laws of spirituality are not arbitrary. The laws of spirituality express the will of God, but expresses the will of God in terms of what that reality becomes. God does not stand above the spiritual world and says, I don't like what you do, and give you a smack, or do this and so on, or throw down a lightning bolt, or whatever have you. God doesn't do this directly. What the Baruch Shem did was to create a physical world which expresses laws inherent in its reality, in its existence. And what the Baruch Shem did was create another reality behind that, which is called the spiritual world, which has its own laws. The Torah, therefore, has to be redefined. The Torah is not a book divinely revealed, which is what? Behavioral prescriptions in terms of how to behave and not to behave. That has nothing to do with the Torah. Nothing. What the Torah is nothing more than a book, which is a description of what it is, an exposition of the laws of spiritual reality. That's all it is. Except it's written in the form of do and don't. But it didn't have to be written in that form. The Baruch Shem could have said very simply, you see, by describing a certain set of laws, the Baruch Shem could have shown you that if you do a malach on Shabbos, if you write on Shabbos, the Baruch Shem could have revealed to you the inherent laws of spirituality, so that as soon as you begin to write on Shabbos, you instantly begin to damage your neshama, and you would see it and understand it. Just like you know that certain schematic electrical diagrams will what? Will amplify circuits or whatever have you. It's the same thing. The Baruch Shem could have showed you the same thing. He didn't have to say you shouldn't write. He didn't have to tell you the 39 forbidden categories of work on Shabbos. He didn't have to tell you it at all. He could have told you the laws of Shabbos, of the reality of Shabbos. He could have told you the laws of what? Has to do with the laws of time and the insertion of Kedusha or spiritual forces with respect to time frames. That, the laws of that, are the laws of Shabbos. And he could have described to you existentially what the essential regulations are in the supernatural world with respect to the seventh day and the inception of a higher degree of Kedusha as it enters into the world. And automatically you understand, well, wait a minute. If such a thing's happening, obviously if I carry on that day, I'm going to be damaging myself. You would understand that yourself. You see. As soon as you understood what the regulations were, what the principles were behind the spiritual world, you would automatically yourself know how to, what behaviors you should and should not do. Just like, for example, a person knows that he should not walk off a cliff. Why? There's no book that he's brought up with. A person knows he shouldn't put his hand into a flame. A person knows he shouldn't drink gasoline. Well, how does a person know this? Where did he learn this? He learned this by sheer experience, you see. But the problem is that we don't have the sheer experience of the supernatural world, because we are not in direct contact. It's hidden from us, even though we access it and we're connected to it. We are all connected to the spiritual realm, the spiritual reality. We're all connected to it. But we do not see the effects that we have on that spiritual world at all. so we can literally kill ourselves constantly and commit suicide over and over and over again and never know. Why? Because the damage that we will incur is an eternal damage. We can't see that. We are only permitted to see physical realities. We are only permitted to see transient consequences, which immediately impinge on us in the physical world. The Rebbeinu Shalom has concealed from us, you see, the consequence of another reality, but that's all it is. The validity of the Torah rests on the mere fact that it is a description of a reality. That's its validity. You see, if the Torah was not some kind of narrative description of a reality, it would be completely like the New York State Penal Code. It would have no more enforcement quality than that. You see. So the power of the Torah does not lie in its laws. The power of the Torah lies in its fact that it describes existence. That's why the do's and don'ts of the Torah matter. If the Torah had nothing to do with existence, the do's and don'ts of the Torah would be meaningless. They would be as meaningless in the do's and don'ts of the penal code itself. So if I can break them all and get away with it, nothing would happen. Surely if a person opens up a television in his house, nobody sees it on Shabbos, and he's alone and privately, who's going to see it? Nobody. Nobody's around. Nobody's going to say, how can you do such a thing? What's the matter with you? You're Machal Shabbos? Nobody's going to say that to him. He won't even feel embarrassed. So why can't he get away with it? So you may say, well, God sees it. The statement that God sees it is an infantile term. God sees nothing, and God sees everything. It's irrelevant, and it has nothing to do with what God sees. Reality sees, because what the Rebbeinu did was to inscribe in reality into a spiritual reality immediate effects from that action. So the reality would simply turn around and instantly begin to produce its own effects. Just like if you're doing gasoline, it will instantly begin to affect your entire physiological system. Instantly. How does it know? How does gasoline know what to do once it gets in your stomach? How does it know what to kill? What cells to kill? How does it know what to interrupt? What hormones to interrupt? And how to wreak havoc with the entire physical system? How does gasoline know how to do that? Nobody ever taught that to gasoline. But the molecules of gasoline, based on its own chemical laws, will interact with the molecules of the body, based on the chemical laws which are what? Which are subsumed by both. And that will kill you. Because that's written into the molecular structure of reality itself. Chilul Shabbos is written into the molecular structure of the spiritual world. God does not have to intervene. God will no more intervene in a person who's Machal Shabbos, and He will intervene in a person who jumps off the roof. It is the same thing. You won't see the hand of God in either case. Why? Because God creates reality. It is reality where the consequences are dealt with. Therefore, the Torah, the validity of the Torah rests on the fact that it is a description of a reality. And because it is a description of a reality, it has immediate and powerful consequences. That's its essence. It happens to be that the Torah is written as do's and don'ts. But God didn't have to write it as do's and don'ts. He could have written the Torah as a book on physics of the supernatural world. We can imagine what that book would have looked like. You see. But the Rebbeinu chose not to do it. The Rebbeinu chose to write it as a book of behavioral prescriptions. I want you to do this, I don't want you to do this. And I want you to learn that book to ultimately understand what this reality called Ruchnis is about. But fundamentally, the reality of Torah must translate itself into what? Into deeds. That's why the Torah is written in the form of deeds. But never forget for an instant, don't be fooled by the way the Torah is written. Don't think for 1 minute that it's similar to a legislative system. The Torah is a textbook on spirituality, and it tells you within its behavioral prescriptions what really is going on.
What do you mean by spiritual?
You have to raise hand. A textbook in physics is a description of how reality behaves. It tells us about the laws of the world. It tells us how it behaves. The Torah is a description also of how the supernatural world behaves also. That's why, and this is an important thing, that's why to people who understand the Torah in that way, on that depth, can control the supernatural world. You see, it's interesting, what Moshe Chaim Lutzada says very, very clearly, that if one knew how, if one understood the laws of that supernatural reality, and in terms of the regulators of that reality, the malachim, the angels and so on, one can literally do miracles, and he can force the miracles. You see, a person can literally come up and split the East River if he knew the forces of spirituality which coincide. He could do it. It is not that difficult. Well, it sounds amazing. It sounds like a nace, but it's not as difficult as it appears. The problem is we are totally ignorant of what that reality looks like, but he could do that. Why? Because there is another reality which is behind that reality. And if he understood the laws of this inner reality, the spiritual reality, he can really subvert it at certain points. That's what witchcraft was. That's what Kishuv is, as you described. How do you think the ancient Egyptians would be able to turn the Nile into blood? How did they know how to do that? That wasn't not an impressive act for the ancient Egyptians. That was commonplace to them. How were they able to do that? Because they understood the laws of the supernaturality behind the physical. So they understood by certain manipulation of certain forces, they could understand exactly how to convert the entire thing into blood. To us, that's an incredible miracle. But not to one who knows the nature of the reality behind the physical. You see, we can send a man to the moon. But look what we have to do to send a man to the moon. Look how many laws we have to transcend. We've got to overcome the laws of gravity and many, many things to begin to get a man to the moon. You see, because we have to overcome or manipulate the laws of physical reality through the laws of physical reality. So we have to learn all the different ways in which we can deviate from it. But we must always use the laws of physical reality. But what happens if you can use the laws of spirituality and go behind it? If you can understand the base, if you can understand the soul of the physical world itself, and the spiritual forces which guide it, and which make it to look the way it does. What happens if you can tap the spiritual force which is responsible for the law of gravity itself? Then you can alter any gravitational consequence on this world without even doing anything physical. Just by tapping the gravitational force on its spiritual level. We don't know how to do that. This knowledge was once known to men, at least to a certain degree. We no longer have that kind of information. But that power is the power of the Torah, except that we don't see it in an open way. If one letter is missing from the Torah, if a sofer, a scribe, leaves out one letter from the Torah, that whole Torah is puzzle. You cannot read it on Shabbos. Why? What's the difference if one letter is missing? Because what the Chachamim say is that the Torah is nothing more. All the letters and all the words in the letters of Torah are nothing more than different names of spiritual powers, what's called different shemas of the Baruch Shalom. But they don't apply to God directly. What they are different forces, or regulatory spiritual forces which exist in all spheres. And the entire Torah, with all the words, if we knew how to reassemble the letters in different kinds of combinations, we can reproduce. You see, we can reproduce what those forces are. We can understand them, and by understanding them, we can literally do all kinds of things which we would consider miraculous. Therefore, the entire Torah itself, from Bereshit to Le'enei Kol Yisrael, to the last word, from Bereshit to Yisrael, which is the first and last word, all the letters in between, even though they read like sentences and they read words, but in a more fundamental level, what happens is those letters essentially can be combined in many, many other ways. And in all the different types of combinations, we would suddenly begin to reveal the physics of the supernatural world itself. So that if one letter is missing, then one aspect of one power is missing in the entire world. And that cannot be. Because the Torah, from beginning to end, represents every force that was ever created in existence. To take one letter out is to take the symbol or the essence of one force, is to leave us with a universe which is incomplete. And that is no longer the Torah, because it is no longer the universe. It is not the spiritual force which guides the world. Hence the entire Torah itself is possible. Let's look into these systems more deeply. Let's get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. I think we have a general idea, but let's look into some of the things that I've said more precisely. I use the word internal, external. external causal necessary symptoms. What am I talking about? Let's again take the two systems, the physical system and the halachic system of the Torah, or the legislative system, in this case, of the penal code. And let's look at them. What happens is, in the laws of physics, we know that, for example, certain laws will produce consequences. We know that if you are given certain bodies in a specific system, and you're familiar with all the forces of that system, you can predict the motion of those bodies to the end of time. We know scientists can understand, by introducing one new force into a given mechanical system, the alteration of that system in terms of how it will move. They know this exactly. How is this done? Cause effect. That's what it's all about. When the Buddha created the world, what he did was he created a concept of cause and effect. The Buddha himself does not relate to the world to what we call cause and effect. And I cannot amplify on that statement. That is a very, very deep statement. But when God created the world, his relationship as a creator to the world that was created is not a cause and effect relationship. When the world came into being, as soon as reality was created, suddenly what existed was the notion of cause and effect, that one thing could produce another. The relationship that we have to study is the relationship between this cause and effect. How necessary is it? If there is a cause, to what degree of necessity will there follow that effect? You see. Now, in the system of physics, in the physical laws, that is absolutely necessary. Every physical cause will produce a certain physical effect in an absolute way. There's no question about it. You see. An object will attract another object automatically, just by the introduction of an object into a certain system. It will immediately attract another object. If a proton, which is negatively charged, comes close to a what? To an electron, if a proton, which is positively charged, comes near an electron, which is negatively charged, there will be a repulsion. It must be like that. That is the nature of their forces. The cause, you see, of what? Of the proximity of these two particles will instantly produce an effect, which is repulsion. It can be predicted and it can be mathematically described precisely. There is a necessary connection between the cause and effect of the physical world. What about cause and effect relationships in the legislative world, in the laws of society? Is there cause and effect? Well, the government says if you steal a car, you get thrown in prison, you will get 5 years. That's what will happen. But the consequence of 5 years, how is that connected to the cause of stealing the car? Does it necessarily have to ensue? No, not necessarily. You can steal the car and not get any time. You cannot do any time for that because you weren't caught. Hence, the connection between cause and effect in all legislative systems is not necessary. What I call these systems is internal versus external necessity. What connects the cause and effect of physical reality? What connects it? Reality itself. Reality itself has within it the regulations which will force this cause to produce that effect. Hence we say that system, that causal system, the causal system or the cause and effect system of the physical world is what is necessary internally. By the internal nature of the cause and effect, necessarily there must be this relationship. Internal necessity. The cause and effect, you see, are connected necessarily because of the internal relationship of the components of the reality of those components. So the laws of the physical universe reflect a system of what's called internal necessity. The cause and effect relations must happen because of the internal nature of those things. Because the cause and effect relationship exists internally in the reality itself. But in the legislative laws, like larceny, for example, we say that this cause and this effect are not necessarily connected. Or rather, they are connected necessarily, but only externally. In other words, if you steal a car, you may or may not go to jail. When do you go to jail? If there's a cop on the corner. There's got to be an external agent of some sort outside of the system who in some way can force the juxtaposition of cause and effect. But in other words, cause and effect do not necessarily come together on their own, because there's nothing in reality that will force the two. There's nothing in reality itself, so that if you steal the car, you must go to jail. There is something in reality that you jump off a roof, you will fall down and get killed. But there is nothing in reality that says stealing the car will bring you in jail. That reality is external, therefore, to the causal system. A cop, a judge, a warden. These are the men who will enforce this relationship. But the men who will enforce this relationship are external, you see, to the cause, which is stealing the car, and the effect, which is 5 years in prison. You've got to introduce external agents to enforce this causal relation. That's why the legislative system is a causal system which is external. It's external necessity. Do we understand the usage of these words? Therefore, when I ask the question, the Torah, what kind of system is the Torah, the halachas of the Torah? Now we can ask it with a little more seichel. We have a little more intelligence now to ask that question. Is it a system of internal or external necessity? Suddenly we become sophisticated philosophers. We can ask the question in a whole different way. And the answer is, the Torah is a causal system of internal necessity, not external necessity. Because if you transgress on the law of the Torah, there is no policeman, there is no external agent who will what? Who will see to it that the consequence will emerge. That consequence will emerge through the reality in which you've impinged. And since by transgressing the law of Torah, you have what? You have impinged into a different world, into a world or reality of a spiritual nature. The cause and effect, the internal cause and effects that exist on that plane will come around to see to it that these two, cause and effect, are necessarily connected. But it's internal. The laws of the Torah are internal, but they are internal to a different reality. That's why it's so easy to be deceived. The cause and effect relationships of the halachas of the Torah to the punishments and rewards that come from them are necessarily connected internally through the laws of a spiritual reality, which is beyond what we see. That's why when we look at the Torah, it's very easy to think that the Torah is a code book or a Bill of Rights or whatever have you, or a constitution. You see, it's easy to confuse the Torah with the constitution or a Bill of Rights because it looks the same. It's written in the same form. It's written behaviorally, do, don't. But I tell you that it's an incredible deception that the system we're dealing in is one of internal necessity, because the Torah, the laws of the Torah relate to a spiritual reality, you see, and they're internally connected. Our main task in terms of the Torah is to fulfill it in terms of our obligations behaviorally, in terms of the way we conduct our life. And the Rebbeinu Shem said, as an afterthought, or rather as a reward in a sense. What the Rebbeinu Shem said is, I want you to do this, I want you to conduct your life according to the system. And then once you do that, then I will allow you to want to investigate the internal nature of that system. And because of that, what the Rebbeinu Shem did was write it in a form, into a code, so that it's rather behavioral at the outset. But he allowed us, and what he did was he showed us through the Chochmah of the Torah how to eventually go into it so that we can understand what the laws of that reality itself. What is Talmud Torah? There are two levels of Talmud Torah, really, learning the Torah. One level we most basically know, but there's another level which we see tonight, which is very, very much hidden. The first level is when we learn Torah, we want to learn Torah because we want to know what to do. In other words, we want to know how to avoid damaging our neshama, how to avoid damaging ourselves by impinging negatively or detrimentally into another reality. And we also want to know how to invigorate or how to strengthen ourselves so that we can utilize the forces of this spiritual reality. What? To give us eternal existence. That's what the Torah is. So the fundamental idea, the fundamental objective is to learn the halachas of the Torah so that we can gain eternity by manipulating the forces of that spiritual world to gain that eternity. We want to know what to do. We want to know the halachas. Second of all, we want to know why we should do it. And the reason why we should do it is what I'm telling you now, and what we've been discussing for quite a while in terms of all these different shiurim. Because the laws of the Torah are a reality. Therefore you have no choice. You may think that you have a choice, but that's a deception. You may think that you will do something for or against the Torah and in some way get away with it. You may think because you choose not to believe in God, you suddenly are exonerated from the laws of spiritual reality. But that's absurd. You can no more exonerate yourself from what? From the laws of spirituality by denying the existence of God, then you can exonerate yourself from the laws of gravity by refusing to believe in Isaac Newton. Just because you jump up and down and you say Isaac Newton was a jerk does not mean that the law of gravity will not take hold of you when you give it the chance. It is the same thing. You can proclaim yourself as the greatest atheist who's ever lived. Whatever you want to do. You can ignore every halach in the Torah, but you will be subject to every one of its consequences, because the laws of the Torah are realities. There's a story I once told a long time ago, basically, where the Vilna Gaon once came over a person who converted to Christianity. And that person took an apple, and he started eating the apple and didn't make a bracha on it. He's a Meshumad, he was a convert, he was a Christian. So he looked at the Vilna Gaon, and the Vilna Gaon says, why didn't you make a bracha? So he said, bracha? What, are you kidding? He said, I'm a convert, I'm a Christian. So he said, not only would the Bonachim get you for the fact that you're over on all tired mitzvahs and you don't keep Shabbos and nothing else, but the Bonachim will also ask and demand of you the consequence of not even making this bracha on this apple. In other words, don't think that you can escape. You cannot resign from being Jewish. It is impossible. Because Judaism is a state of the soul. To be a Jew is to be a certain type of neshama. To be a Gentile is to be a different type of neshama. There is no getting around it unless a Gentile converts. There are certain laws to this. You see. That's why there's such an incredible struggle going on in Israel now in terms of what? In terms of who is considered a Jew. You see, there's a great controversy going on in the state of Israel now about who is considered Jewish. And of course, according to Orthodoxy, according to the Torah, the halacha that says that somebody is Jewish is an individual who was born of a Jewish mother. That is the central factor, regardless of who the father is. But according to the way the Reform or conservative Jews attempt to interpret it, they want to set their own criteria and say that anyone is Jewish, as long as they do whatever they want to do, and so on. Also in terms of conversion, there are specific regulations in terms of how conversion is done. They want to set their own regulations, and what they don't understand is that just as it is the Torah who gave the legitimacy to being a Jew is a metaphysical entity. A Jew is an individual with a certain type of neshama, and because of that neshama, if he does or does not do certain things, he will impinge on a supernatural reality, and that supernatural reality will follow him with its consequences. Because he has a certain type of neshama that is able to interface with that reality. A goy is an individual who cannot interface with that reality in the same way. Why not? Because his neshama is not built the same way. And there's no ands, ifs, or buts. The koyach of a Jew is the fact that he was born and he has the ability to interface with the spiritual reality of which the Torah happens to be talking about. There is a concomitance between the Jew and the Torah. A goy does not relate to the Torah, because the Torah is talking about a spiritual world, and the goy cannot interface to that spiritual world. That's why a goy and Torah do not have any specific interface. Not because the Bonachim is a discrimination in this case. The goy was built in a certain way, and we have explained before how, to some extent, and I don't want to go into it, the origin of goyim, because they themselves denied the Torah. So what the Bonachim has done was create a new type of human being. A new type of human being, a new type of person, which can no longer interface with spiritual worlds on the level, which is possible. Now, goyim do interface with spiritual worlds. They can, but on much smaller levels. But on the levels in which to acquire eternal existence, on the level that has to do with Olam Haba, A guy cannot interface with that level of supernatural reality. Hence the 613 commandments are meaningless to a guy. Because if he keeps the 613 commandments, he gets nothing positive. And if he doesn't keep it, he gets nothing negative. Because he does not interface with it, in any sense of the word. You see, he is like a person, for example, who simply goes from one time dimension to another. He simply is not a person of a third dimension. A goy. With respect to the reality of the Torah, a goy, the neshama of the goy cannot interface with it. Neither positively or negatively, in either case. He has nothing to do with that reality. A Jew is an individual who metaphysically has the capacity to interface with the kind of reality that the Torah is talking about. That's why that Torah applies to him. Now you can't just make up the definition of that kind of person. You can't create that kind of person. That kind of person must be what's described by the Torah itself. Now a goy can become a Jew. It's possible through conversion process. And when a goy becomes a Jew, what happens is he elevates the neshama so that metaphysically, suddenly he interfaces with a whole new reality. That is the essence of conversion. But if you don't do it according to the Torah, you don't do it at all. It's a joke. It's meaningless. That's why the controversy on who's considered a Jew and who's considered a converted Jew is an enormous controversy. The question that I want to discuss now is a deeper view of the internal necessary system. What is the structure of a system which is internally designed? How does it work? How is it that when a person is Mechal Shabbos, how does he actually in some way affect the reality that in somehow he is affected? Something will come around again and in certain ways yield negative consequences. How does that really work? The best thing that we could do is to observe the closest thing to the Torah, which is what? The laws of physical reality. Because now we have to remember that the sciences which deal with the laws of physical reality are essentially dealing with internal necessary causal systems. Those people who deal with what? Legislative systems, sociological systems, economic systems, all these other systems and political systems are dealing with the systems which are externally necessary. Those causal systems have nothing to do with reality. Only the natural sciences deal with natural phenomena, and only the natural sciences, which are the hand of God, deal with internal necessary systems. The only other system which is similar to the sciences, which looks like a humanistic system, is the Torah. But it is a system which deals with real natural phenomena as well. Except the natural phenomena in this case are supernatural. And what we want to know is, how does that work? Very simply, without going to a great depth, which is not at this point in time, we'll go into much greater depth later on. If we look at the natural laws itself, or the natural world, how does it work? How does the cause and effect relationship actually exist in the world of the sciences? If we investigate the nature of physical reality in a very simplistic way, we will see that fundamentally there are different levels of physical reality itself. What do I mean by different levels of physical reality? We'll see that, for example, if you look at an object, if I look at this piece of chalk, I observe certain characteristics of this chalk. It has a color, it has a certain shape, it has a certain type of substance, it has certain physical properties. It also has certain types of chemical properties. It will interact with other types of elements and produce different kinds of chemical compounds. Whatever the story is. But basically what I see at the gross level, at the macroscopic level, at the largest level, is a piece of chalk. It's an object. If I want to see its different characteristics, I see that it obeys certain laws of motion. You see. It responds in certain ways. It is a macroscopic object. But if I say to myself, what is this piece of chalk made of? What is it made of? I say, well, this piece of chalk is made of molecules or atoms in certain types of combinations. I forget what is it? Calcium carbonate? What is it? Calcium carbonate. Yeah. The compound calcium carbonate chalk. Okay? If I was able to look at this in a deeper level, I would see that what I see is a single piece of chalk is really nothing more than an aggregate of billions and billions of molecules. Atoms running around composed of something called calcium and something called carbon and something called oxygen. So that the atoms of these three different elements combine in such a way to produce chalk. Now if I look at each particular atom, a calcium or carbon or an oxygen atom, they have nothing to do with a piece of chalk. They don't look like chalk at all. They look like something entirely different. In fact, not only do they look like something entirely different, their reality is something entirely different. They exist on the world of energy and the world of forces, positive and negative forces, and different types of realities and so on. They don't even look like a hard substance. You can't go over to a calcium atom and touch it, even if it's possible. It's not something that can be touched. It's a force field of some kind of energy, you see. Which means that this solid piece of chalk, you see, is essentially a result of a more fundamental system. And that fundamental system is a molecular system. Different elements coming together to form a compound, calcium carbonate. But what's produced here is different types of what? Molecules. A molecule of chalk. At the molecular level, these molecules subscribe to their own laws. They have their own system of laws. Molecules obey their own particular systems. But wait, what are molecules composed of? Let's say suddenly I shrank, and I'm now down to the world of what? Of molecules. And I look inside this piece of chalk, and I can walk inside, and I see around me hundreds of trillions of these rapidly moving objects colliding constantly. And I want to understand is, what is that thing? What is the thing that just passed by me? This molecule in very rapid motion, you see. So what I do is, I suddenly I run over into my miraculous vehicle of some sort, and I grab one of these molecules and I begin to investigate. And I hold it, I imprison it in some kind of force field. I look at it, and I see amazingly, I see that this thing is composed of three different orbital systems: calcium atom, an oxygen atom, and a carbon atom, and that each of these atoms is a whole different universe. It's like a solar system. Well, very simply, a solar system where you have massively positively charged particles in a center being surrounded and enveloped by very small negatively charged particles, almost 1/2000 difference in size. And I say to myself, this is an incredible structure, but this has nothing to do with a molecule. This is what I call an atom. It's no more atoms getting together to form molecules, or molecules getting together to form objects. We're now at what's called the atomic level. What are the laws of the atomic level? The laws of atomic physics. All the laws of atomic physics, right, essentially deal with the laws of the atom. And the atom in this case being a nucleus and surrounding electrons. How atoms constantly interrelate with each other and the very different phenomena which occur among themselves. But I'm not satisfied because I want to know more. So what I do is I prop up my vehicle and I go even further down to atomic level and I begin to go towards the nucleus. And I go into the nucleus and I begin to examine the particles themselves. What is a proton? I want to know. What is a proton? And then I begin to see, wait a minute, when I begin to get into the nucleus, I suddenly see a whole different world. I begin to see protons and certain forces that go between the two of them. Different particles. I begin to see hundreds of different particles, mesons, and muons, and gluons, and so on and so forth. But it's a whole different world. And I see that the world of mesons and the world of what? Of photons and all these particles have nothing to do with the world of protons, really. But somehow the world of protons is a summation or a result of this tiny little world of subatomic particles. But have I finished? No, because I can go down further into an even deeper world. So I go on to what they call the world of quarks. Have we finished? No, we can go further. And where we are further is a very big controversy. At this point, it may be something called strings. But that's not really critical. What is the relationship of these various different planes? What is really going on here? I have no interest in discussing the laws of these different planes. First of all, I'm not a physicist. That's number one. But what's critical is I want to understand the structure of the law system which pervades these different planes. Because I want to know the basic understanding, I want to know the basic rules or the form that a causal system takes when it's necessary internally. What am I talking about? Let's go to this strange looking object which looks like an ice cream cone on the right side of the board. It is a cone, okay? This cone represents, in a certain sense, the hierarchy of all phenomena, causally. What am I talking about? On the lowest level, we'll start with subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are certain types of entities or certain types of components. They are entities. They are some kind of existential beings. They are real. What they are is open to question, but they are real. There is something really called a proton. There is something really called an electron, at least at that level. What they are composed of more fundamentally, we will disregard. We will assume that the subatomic particle is the smallest level for our discussion. So therefore what we do is we list all these different subatomic particles. And let's say we come up with a list of 10. There are 10 different subatomic particles. And we say, what is the relationship of these subatomic particles? How do they interface with each other? How do they interact? So we say there are 50 different laws of interaction between these 10 different particles. How interesting. We reduced the entire world of subatomic particles to 10 entities and 50 principles or 50 regulations of how these 10 entities will behave with each other. For example, if two of them will come at a certain distance, they will repel. But if two of them come at another distance, they will attract. If two of them come at a certain or if two of them spin in a different way, then the third particle will be affected. Whatever law you want, that's not relevant. But what happens is we have entities and we have specific principles of behavior of that system. That's the system itself. It is an integral, holistic system. It has nothing to do with anything else. But wait, what happens is that when these particles begin to combine, when these subatomic particles begin to combine, what happens is they begin to produce a new type of entity. And that entity is called an atom. You see, that entity, which is a new entity, is based on what? On the combinations of these more fundamental units. So these fundamental units, with respect to the way they behave, now form new kinds of entities called atoms. Now, if I'm in the world of atoms, I see an interesting thing, that these atoms themselves, which are the basic entities at that plane, have their own laws of behavior. They have their own ways of behaving, you see. And then what I do is I accumulate my entire information on atoms, and I notice that there are what? That there are, let's say, 100 different atoms, and I see that they have 180 or 100 principles of behavior, which accrue and which are unique to that system. But then I go further and I say these atoms themselves, is this where I stop? No, we go further up. And we see the atoms create something called molecules. And so there's a new kind of what? Entity created called a molecule, which has its own system of laws, its own system of behavior, the way it will interface and interact with each other. Do you see what I'm saying? And finally the molecules themselves will get together to perform another plane of existence called our universe. Now the interesting question is, what does one plane have to do with the next? If on each plane there is its own specific entity, and on each plane each one has its own specific regulation with regard to the behavior of those entities, what is the interface? What is the ultimate connection between all these levels? And here's where I recognize the most incredible kind of structural design in the following way. The reason why objects in our world, chalk for example, has the characteristics that it has. For example, let's take a better example. Let's take gold, the metal gold, and let's say the gas oxygen. Both of them are elements. Gold is an element, okay, and oxygen is an element. But they're very different, aren't they? Incredibly different. One is a solid, the other is a gas. They are both physically different. They have totally different physical properties. You see, with regard to what? With regard to the way they look, with regard to the way they appear. They have different chemical properties. Oxygen will combine with many types of other elements, gold will not. You see, why is gold gold and why is oxygen oxygen? Why? Well, that sounds like a strange question. What do you mean, why? When I mean why, I don't mean why God made it that way. That's not my concern. But what is the internal nature of gold versus the internal nature of oxygen, such that oxygen has these properties and gold has these properties? That's the question. In other words, when I say, why is this object this way, what I want to know is, what is the internal construction of the object? What is the internal design of this object, such that the ensuing entity is something we call gold? And the answer is, go down to the next level, the molecular level. Because of the molecules of gold, you see, are the way they are, therefore the ultimate entity which ensues, which is gold, has physical and chemical properties. Because its molecules exist in a certain way. Change those molecules and you change the entire thing. You come to oxygen. Oxygen has a whole different system of molecules than gold. That's why oxygen appears entirely different. So basically what we see is that all objects in the world, the way they look, all their properties, physical properties, chemical properties, mechanical properties, everything about every different substance in the world is so because of the internal construction of that object with respect to its molecular structure. You see. You know, there's something about the laws of molecules and the way they behave which will determine the way the ultimate object will behave. Okay, we don't stop there. Why do the molecules of gold behave the way they do? And the molecules of oxygen behave the way it does? The answer is because of the specific atomic structure. And then finally, the atomic structure because of the subatomic structure. What do we see? What we see are different systems. Different systems. Each one forming the internal construction of the one above it. And each one being responsible for the one above it. It is the reality of subatomic particles. It is their combinations, their permutations. It is the way they relate to each other, the way they interface, that produces the laws of atomic physics. Why are there laws of atomic physics? What controls the laws of atomic physics? The answer is because of the ultimate laws of subatomic physics. If we would understand the interrelationship of all subatomic particles, the different kinds of subatomic particles, the way they interrelate and the laws of their behavior, we will be able to predict every other type of particle atom which ensues from this more internal system. So therefore, the entities and behavior on this system is a direct result of the entities and laws of the more internal system. It is the same thing going up and down. So therefore, we see finally what the relationship is between one system and another. We don't have 5 different systems existing on 5 different planes, each one independent of each other. It's not like that. It's not like one thing contains something inside of it, and that has something inside of it, and so on. Where each system in some way is covered by the other one above it, but in some way retains its own independence. It's not that. They all merge, you see. They all merge through their laws, because the reality of this system governs the reality of that system. And the reality of the atomic system governs the reality of the molecular system, which finally governs the reality of the entire macroscopic universe itself. The laws of gravity, you see. Even though we see the laws of gravity through massive objects, the law of gravity is true of massive stellar objects, stars, galaxies, and it's true of all these things. But the law of gravity is the way it is because of certain things about the behavior of molecules. And the laws of molecules exist the way it is because of the behavior of atomic particles and so on. So that each system is dependent on the internal structure of the more fundamental system. Now that's one important thing. So therefore we see that the phenomena at any particular point is a direct outgrowth, is a direct consequence, is a direct product of the laws of its internal system. That's the way the universe is built. There is another fundamental feature of these systems. If you will examine these systems, you will find another amazing thing. Which system has more and more laws? Which system has more entities and more principles? The answer is the top one. Because as you go from top to bottom, you get fewer and fewer particles and fewer principles. You see. If you look at the laws of reality, you see an amazing thing. And this is what Newton said. Einstein said, which is the thing. Einstein said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. What was he talking about, Einstein? What Einstein was talking about, if you look at the knowable universe, the observable universe, or whatever have you will see countless different types of phenomena and events. Even if you look at the laws of motion, look at moving objects. There are so many different types of motion. There are motions between planets, motions of comets. There are motions, there are tides. You see. Then there's the motion of what? Of objects on Earth. There's the motions of different vehicles. There's so many different types of motions. And therefore the system appears incredibly chaotic. So what Einstein said was that the amazing thing was that in a system which appears totally chaotic and so varied lies certain just simply basic laws that will describe all of them. And that's what Newton did. What Newton did was Newton figured out once and for all the basic laws of motion and the fundamental forces in the world. So from these couple of laws, there's a couple of laws on a couple of pages, he was able to predict the motion of objects in the entire universe, including comets. Such a thing had never been done before. So what Newton showed was, don't be fooled by the variation of phenomena, because the variation of phenomena really is the result of a more fundamental system. and if we can understand, which is pure in its laws, and if we can understand the laws of that fundamental system, we can predict that entire macroscopic system with ease. That's why Newtonian physics stood as a bedrock of physics for 200 years, because it was so successful. It was the first attempt, and it was the first incredibly successful attempt to reduce various phenomena to a bunch of basic principles. That's what it means. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe, it is that it's comprehensible. But that's the aspect of it. The aspect is that it is comprehensible because of the laws of structural design. Because one system is based on the internal laws of a more fundamental system. And the thing is, as you go to a more and more fundamental system, you have fewer and fewer laws and fewer entities. That's the critical thing. Thus, geometrically, we can describe the entire idea by what's called a cone, you see, where the entire thing converges at the point where if we intersect this cone three-dimensionally through it, you see, we evoke what's called planes. Now, if you have a cone, you see, and if you intersect it at a point near the top, then the circle which is created, right, will have a larger diameter than to the intersection at a lower point, or at a lower point. The lower you get in the cone, then the circle which results from the intersection has a much more smaller diameter. I use that as a geometrical metaphor to symbolize that the entities and the laws at the lowest level have the least number of phenomena, and the ones at the higher have a much greater level of phenomena. So that finally when you get to the top of the cone, you are dealing with a macro system which yields the greatest number of phenomena, you see, because it yields the greatest number of entities. But really it's one cone, you see. And as you get deeper and deeper in the system, it becomes fewer and fewer principles. That is the way God created the universe. God created the universe in, so to speak, this design, where that He created macroscopic systems whose essential laws and properties are fundamentally caused by more internal systems, which are fewer in entities and principles, and so on down the line, until you finally come back to the point itself. And that point is the inception of being, or the inception of cause and effect being itself. God is outside of this cone. God is not a being who is subject to cause and effect. Everything in this cone, if I may use the metaphor, is subject to cause and effect. Nothing escapes it. The Ribono Shel Olam is outside of that cone. Hence the world of God, or the Ein Sof, we say, is a non-cone type of reality. What is that kind of reality? We will not discuss that at this point in any sense. Suffice it to understand the nature of a causal system. Now, if this is a causal system of a system which is internal necessity, do we understand what it means now? Why there is internal necessity? Why? Because what happens is, on the level, on the reality of subatomic particles, because of their laws, they force the level of atomic particles to behave in their way, so that the laws of atomic physics are necessary, and they are caused by the laws of the subatomic particles. There is an internal connection. The laws of atomic physics are necessarily caused and are internally produced by the laws of subatomic particles. And so it is with all of these systems. This is the basic structure of what's called an internal causal system. Now, what is all this about? Let us now go to the Torah. What is the Torah? What is its system? And here's where we go. In physical world, we understand the basic system. It has taken mankind a long time to discern what the fundamental planes of reality are, and the interface of these particular levels of reality. But what about Torah? What about the Torah? What are its systems? Now, what do I mean by its systems? 100 people board a plane in Paris, France, headed en route to Frankfurt, Germany. What happens? Engine trouble appears, the plane goes down, 100 people all lose their lives. They all die. Okay, let's examine that event. Let's examine that event in virtue of everything we've discussed till now. What happened? How did God do that? That sounds like a strange question. Why? It's no stranger than how does God work one the law of gravity? How does he do it? We now know that God does it internally. And we now know that he does it by internal systems. The question is, can we have a deeper understanding of that? How does God do that? Well, these 100 people were on the plane and they all died. So all of them were obligated to die. As I said, death is not the cessation of life. More fundamentally, death is the cessation of opportunity to choose. God no longer needs to know how you will choose. When that point comes, life is no longer necessary. Sounds somewhat clinical, but that's essentially what it is. Now, these people, 100 people, had to die. They all had to die. Why? For different reasons, for probably 100 different reasons. So, how do you think it worked? You think the Bonisham sat up there, Kaviyoko, up there on his throne and says, let's see now. I got these 100 people here. This Malach runs up and says, I got 100 people on the list. The Malach over says, and we have to waste them. If I may use the language, we have to make them disappear. So the Bonisham sits down and says, well, let's see how we're going to do it. Let's figure out how to do it. Let's figure out how to do it. I know what we'll do. What we'll do is the following. We'll get all these people to come on a plane at the same time and then cause engine trouble so the plane will crash and they will all die. But the Sultan says, well, how are we going to get all these people on the plane? How are we going to do that? How are we going to contrive to get 100 people to get on this particular flight? So the Bonisham says, well, let's figure it out. Let's figure out all the different plans that they have. Let's figure out the business plans or the personal plans. So in such a way, well, let's see, this person has to get on the plane because let's make a wedding over here in Frankfurt, Germany. So he's going to have to be on the plane. This other guy, well, let's create a business meeting in Frankfurt, Germany. So he's going to have to go on the plane. You think that the Bonisham sits up there in an incredible, massive computational effort to figure out how to get all these people on this plane? Of course not. That's absurd. Yet, in effect, that's what the Bonisham has to do. He has to get them all on the plane. Now, you may say, why do all these people have to die on this plane? Because obviously, the decree of death is not only the decree of the cessation of life, how you die is just as important as the fact that you die. Very important. We see that from the Torah. That the manner of death, and the way it pursues, and the way it happens, all these things are critical to the edict of death itself. They are all critical. And the Malach HaMovet cannot veer an iota from the Gzera. When the Malach HaMovet is told, so-and-so is to die at this microsecond, to such and such a thing, to a cerebral hemorrhage, the Malach HaMovet cannot cause a what? A heart attack. Because the guy's got to die of a stroke. There is no permission given to the Malach HaMovet to cause a heart attack. Well, what's the difference if you have an embolism in the heart, you have in the brain? Because that's what it is. There must be an embolism in the brain. He has to die of a stroke. That's how precisely tuned the thing is. And at exactly the right second. Which means the fact that all these people have to die on a plane is specific and must be done this way. But how does it work? It works in the following way. When we see 100 people getting on a plane and the plane crashing, that is the macroscopic system. That's the system. That's how we observe the event. But how do these people get on the plane? Number one. And number two, what is it that each one has done to produce this particular gzera, this edict? So obviously what there is are subsystems. There is subsystem 1, subsystem 2, subsystem 3. What happens is each of these individuals did something, a certain type of deed, and that deed affected these subsystems down to the bottom. You see, each one of these individuals did what he did and affected each one of these subsystems. The subsystem itself then went up and determined in the macroscopic system that the person would die in a plane crash. But more than that, it determined the time, the place, the kind of plane. It determined the level, how the reservations would be made, everything down to the last iota. Because these subsystems have nothing to do with the physical subsystems. They have to do with systems of what? Of behavior. They have to do with systems of how people relate. Who is related to who? It has to do with systems of motivation. What do I feel like doing, what I don't feel like doing? The entire thing goes through the psyche of man and through the interconnection of all societal people and the way people relate. People relate through business or they relate through family and the different events that people do. But you see, we have no understanding of the nature of that kind of subsystem because it looks to us, it looks like a haphazard system. You see, if I decide to go to the store, or I decide to go to a movie, what's the difference really? But we don't realize that by doing one of two different things, we interface on a completely different subsystem in the spiritual world. But we have no idea what that subsystem is. But by doing two different events, an aspect of subsystem one is instantly impinged. And when that's impinged, the domino effect, it goes all the way down. So that when finally the thing comes back up, it affects the subsystem one, which is the higher system, and then hits the macroscopic system. So that in the behavioral life system that we know, in the way we conduct our lives, our situation is altered so that exactly the consequence ensues. We do not know these subsystems. They're not given to us. What is given to men are the subsystems in physics. In the last 100 years, even less than last 100 years, men have finally begun to understand what the subsystems are physically. They've begun to understand the concept of molecules and atoms and now subatomic particles. We have no idea at this point in time what the subsystems are with respect to human events. But there are such subsystems as the cone will dictate. And the exact way that what events happen to us physically, they happen to us spiritually. Except what is invisible to us are the subsystems. But structurally, there's an exact parallel. You see, understand this, there's an exact parallel. There is a notion of cause and effect, there is a notion of internal necessity. There is. And there's a notion of subsystems constantly being what? Being the consequence of the production of a more internal, simpler subsystem. So that the basic structural forms of what? Of causation remain the same. But we do not know these subsystems, not at our point. But what will happen is, at the beginning of the Messianic time, that one of the cardinal things that the Mashiach will do is introduce and write for the first time the physics of human events. And it will look very similar to the Principia, written by Sir Isaac Newton, in 1640 or whatever it was. It will look very similar. It will involve similar subsystems, of a total different nature, and you will see the exact precision of why everything was done. You will see for the first time what every deed that you did, from the smallest thing, you will understand for the first time the interface and the interconnection of any specific deed that you do, and how suddenly it goes from one end of the system to the other, and how it makes a complete circuit from beginning to end. The Mashiach will write that book at the behest of the Baruch Shalom. But that is the first time that book will really be written. You see. Einstein said again, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And I believe I've explained that. What Einstein meant. Wait. That's what Einstein said. Because what is the signature of God? The signature of God is the ability to enact total and absolute organization in the veneer of total chaos. Yeah. That is the koyach of the Baruch Shalom. No one else has that power. Men cannot do that. Something which is created by the intelligent mind looks like it was created like the intelligent mind. You can't walk into a desert and see an IBM computer and say that this was chance. We see by the structure that an intelligence must have created it. Because the product of mankind reflects intellectual activity. There's no way around it. But the product of God is a totally different thing. The Baruch Shalom can create something which apparently in its outer surface looks totally chaotic. It has no pattern, no system, no rhyme, no reason. Yet underneath is the most incredible subtlety that was ever made before. Like Einstein said a number of times, and I'm quoting him a lot tonight, God does not play dice with the world. The world is not run by chance, but the world is run by incredible what's called isomorphic determinism, cause and effect to an astounding degree. And Einstein maintained this as a critical principle of his entire life. That's what the Baruch Shalom does. And Einstein knew that. When they finally came to him, I think I mentioned before, when the general theory of relativity in 1916 was finally confirmed, they came to him And they said to him in a telegram, I don't know if you know anything about the general theory of relativity, it is the most incredible theory ever constructed by the mind of a person. Most elegant theory. It essentially details the inner subsystem of gravity itself. And it shows how gravity comes from the laws of time and space. What Einstein did exactly was to show the internal necessity of gravity, and he identified the more deeper or profound, more fundamental subsystem. You see. And what happened was, is that when they finally came to him and they said, we've proven it, because no one has ever proven the general theory, and they came to him with a telegram, so when the telegram was delivered to him, he looked at the telegram and he just simply folded it up and put it aside. So the person who delivered it says, how can you do that? How can you be so what? So indifferent about this? Your theory has been confirmed. So he said, so what? I always knew it was true. It was obvious. Was he arrogant? Was this an arrogant remark? No. Einstein said, which is true of him, he had such a fine tune, he was so sensitive to the laws of internal necessity with respect to physical reality. He was able to read it from its head. Like Mozart was able to hear music out of nowhere. He was able to compose the most incredible music just by listening to it. Einstein had the same ability when it came to physical reality. He listened to the laws of physics. And he understood because Einstein in his heart knew the law of causation by internal necessity. So he knew the system must work because it's totally elegant, it is beautiful. And the fundamental law of physics is beauty, not truth. Physics know the systems are true because they're beautiful. What does that mean? Because beauty, which is the sense of harmony and perfect pattern, tells me when something is true. And Einstein knew that a general theory was true because it's magnificently beautiful. You see, the fact that someone confirmed it later on was really not that relevant. It was nice for physics. It was their problem, but not his. But he was a man who had such sensitivities in physical laws of the universe. What happens if you went over to Einstein and you said, excuse me, Reb Einstein, what do you have to say about the laws of human history? You see, if God was able to construct physical reality to such a magnificent degree, where God does not play dice, where God can conceal chaos, He can conceal absolute design in what? In a total chaos. What do you see about the laws of human history itself? It looks chaotic, doesn't it? But is there a reason to history? Is there some thread of system that goes to history? Einstein would say, definitely not. Because Einstein was not capable of making that transfer. He refused to believe that there was a God in history, or there was a God in human events. The same Einstein who was so sensitive, you see, about the chaos of physical systems, refused to acknowledge it about the Hashgacha. But I tell you, and what the Torah tells you, and what the Baruch Hashem says, is that this is its deception. If you think that the Baruch Hashem is good, if you think that He's really good, you see, He is skilled, He is an expert at hiding design from chaos in the physical universe, you haven't seen anything until you look at what? Your own personal lives. Because most of us, when we examine our personal life, it looks totally chaotic. Without rhyme or reason, without prediction. But therein lies the true emes and the ultimate science. It is the ultimate science of the what? Of the ultimate system itself. Which are the subsystems of what? Of human events themselves, which are unknown, because the Baruch Hashem has never revealed them. God's will and the Baruch Hashem's koyach is contained in the cone, you see, in the cone of phenomena that relate to human events, and refuses to reveal it to mankind. He is given the gift of knowledge when it comes to the cone, the system, the intrinsic, internal necessity system of physics. He refuses to give to us when it comes to human history, because that he still keeps to himself. And he just gives us his generalities. And Rabbi Chaim Luzzatto, and before him, was among the first of the individuals that began to reveal what these subsystems were in an extremely vague, obscure, and general fashion. It remains ultimately for the Mashiach to produce the system. That's why it says at the end of Koheles, V'akol dovo yom v'mishpat, akol nelam. It says at the end of time in Yom Adin, everything which was hidden will become known and understandable. How? What is it understandable? Because it's very simple. It is subject to law, cause and effect. That's why there's no big kedusha here. There's nothing big here. The things that happen to you are determined or predetermined in a sense by the essential laws that are built into the reality in which you impinge. That's all. It simply remains for you to become aware of what that reality is. For you to understand why God does everything the way He does. Just like 14th century man had no idea why the planets go the way they do, or what comets are, you see, or what causes all the different events. They had no idea until Newton came along and said, here's the student, I'm going to teach you what it's all about in a couple of principles. We, at this point, are medieval in our conception. And the essence of the Messianic period is to reveal the metaphoric tone of the system which relates to human events. That is the essence. And once that system is revealed, that is the power of the Mashiach. At that point, and the earth, the entire world will become filled with the knowledge of the Bnei Shalom, with an absolute certainty, like the waters cover the sea. What is the power of the Mashiach? How is the Mashiach going to do it? What's clear? He's not going to raise a staff and split the Red Sea. He's not going to bring any 10 plagues, at least from the standpoint that we know. So what will be his clear? His clear is das, seichel. He will introduce an understanding that has never been introduced before, that has never been known before. There is no man that has ever existed that will know what he has known. In any sense, whether it's Moshe Rabbeinu, other missions, or anyone. And that's what Chazal learned out, what the Gemara learns out, is that the Mashiach in his wisdom, in his sickness, in understanding of this system, is greater than the Malachim themselves. That's why the Mashiach is the individual who par excellence will explain and convince with an absolute certainty the existence of God. Why? Because the existence of God will become totally understood when the system of God is understood. The reason why we deal with the problem of God, because we deal with the problem of life. As long as we're in turmoil about what life is about, as long as we're confused about the meaning of life, and where it's going, and what is happening, we will be confused about the existence of God. But the day that we understand precisely what that system is, we will also know precisely that God is, and that God exists, and that God rules the world with a very clear, precise, and just system itself.